Welcome to our class again this morning. I'm glad that you joined us as we study the book of James. Today we are in James chapter 2, verses 14 to 26. And to start with, I wanted to ask you a simple question. It may be a strange one for this time of morning, but it's a simple one. How do you know if you're alive? If you ask a doctor that question, he's going to tell you it's all about your vital signs. And they've got these signs that tell you about mortality and viability. Things like blood pressure and heart rate and respiration and brain activity. And all of those things tend to go into a diagnosis that says this person is still alive. Now, that's maybe true, but you need to think about a man named Willie Jackson. Jackson was a 78-year-old Mississippi man in 2014 when he began to have problems and he passed out. And it looked like he was gone. And so ambulances were called. They came. They could find no pulse. They could find no respiration. They rushed him to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Doctors ordered him to be put in a body bag and taken to the morgue where he'd be shipped off to a funeral home so the body could be embalmed, as it always is. But when the mortician opened the body bag, they found that he was still alive. But as some people have said, his problem was just wrong timing. For even though they revived him, he only lived 2 more weeks before he did pass away. But the signs of being alive seem to be so simple. But let me ask you the question about your spiritual life. What makes faith alive? What brings it to life? What makes it show that it has some sort of vitality and vim and vigor and makes it active? How do you know your faith is alive? That's a question that James wants to ask. James is very practical. And so what he wants to do is say, now let's talk about your faith, not as a concept, not as a theological idea. And there's a lot of things could be done in this passage. You could talk about how Paul and James vary in their view of faith and works, and any commentary will go to great lengths to talk about that. But this morning, we want to do one simple thing. James has a message to get across, and he wants people to ask that question. How do you know your faith is alive? And so that's what we're going to ask today. James opens this passage with an interesting concept, one that we may not ask very much. But James wants to probe this, and so he opens with the question that sounds very much like the opening question of the day. Is your faith alive? He says in verse 14, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deed? Can such faith save them? He talks about a certain kind of faith. He says, can such faith as this thing that we're talking about, the question is, what kind of faith is he wanting to discuss? I think it all begins with finding out what happens when faith looks dead. And James does give us some hints, and he leaves the tracks in the sand that says this is what points to a dead faith. One is a claim. When people say they have faith, but that's all they do. Verse 14 that we just read says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith? If they say they have faith. Oh, I have faith. Good. How do I know you have faith? I have faith. Their profession is enough for them. As long as I tell you I believe, nothing else matters. And James says there are some people who come to the world and they ask those questions like that my faith, well, I have faith. And we're always wondering, what kind of faith do they really have? If it's just the faith they talk about, it's just the faith they want to confess. Oh, I believe. What do you believe? Oh, I believe the right things. There are some who have weepy emotions when it comes to faith. They cry the right tears. But if you ask, do they really believe? How do you know that? All you have is their word for it. So James is concerned that there are some who are just claiming or just saying things about their faith, but you don't know whether it's real or not. It's just a word at some point. And then he goes on to say, let's look at this faith a little bit, such faith a little bit more. First, if it's claimed, the second is you have to look and see what happens when it encounters real life. And so in verses 15 and 16, James has a case study. Now, we don't know whether this is just hypothetical. We don't know whether this was based on an actual event, but it is close enough to the truth where you can see this might happen. And he says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. And if one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? What good does it do? You can see the picture. In the ancient world, there was a large chasm between rich and poor. The rich had superfluous amounts of money and wealth. The poor were beggarly. They survived usually only by going to the streets, extending their palms, and saying, alms for the poor, alms for the poor. They relied on the charity of good people. Many of them went days without eating. They all wore rags that would barely cover their bodies and would not keep them warm at night. These were people in great need, and anything would help them. But I think it's sarcastic the way he puts it. He says, you meet one of these people and you say, well, go in peace. They have no peace. How can they go in peace? Then you continue to say, keep warm and well fed. They are anything but warm and they are anything but fed, much less well fed. But you're wishing them things they cannot have on their own. And you're not going to help them. He says, but you do nothing about it. And you say, go in peace. Now, we have a phrase that's an ancient form of saying goodbye. We might say it this way, God bless you. If you say God bless you and you have nothing and you do nothing for them, how can you decide that you have any kind of faith? Because you haven't done anything. One of the things that James has to say about this empty, hollow, dead faith is it does nothing more than when it sees a need, it says the right words, but it won't meet the need. It won't do anything to meet the need and to fix it. If you really believed, he says, you do something about it. But because you do nothing about it, whatever faith you profess, it must be dead because it has no activity to it. And then he goes on to say, but then there are those who like to categorize faith. Someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. See, there are those who always will say, I'm praying for this, but don't expect me to come because I just have the gift of faith. He said, someone will say, you have faith, but I have deeds. And James says, let me tell you, show me your faith without your deeds, and I'll show you my faith by my deeds. So there's a proof of that. It is this idle characterization that as long as you have faith, you don't need to do anything. That is a deadness that comes along. It is a decay and a rot in faith. That somewhere it doesn't do anything and it just idly says, I still have it. And I fit into the category of faith. But then there's a fourth kind, a fourth sign that faith is dying. That is, you have the same faith the demon does. Now that might get your attention. James says, you believe that there is one God. Probably that comes from what is called the Shema, which are the first words of Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. It was the opening of the prayer that got them ready for worship. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The basic tenet of monotheism is that there is one and only one God. And the Jews, as they were raised, that was the fodder of their prayers. There's one God, and they believed that with all their heart. It was the bedrock foundation of all things. It was the truth, and idols were false. So they were saying, we believe the right things. And James says, you believe that there's one God. Well, good. I think he's sarcastic there again. Well, good for you. I remember several years ago, my granddaughter was about 3 or 4 at that time, sat in the back seat of our car when my wife was driving her around. They had a habit of not keeping their cars very clean, and my wife cleaned up her car pretty well. And so she looked in the back seat and she said, did you notice that Gami has a nice clean car today? And my granddaughter, who's innocent as can be, says in a monotone voice, well, good for you. I think that's what James is saying here. Well, good for you. I'm glad you believe that. That's a given. But then he goes on to say, even the demons believe that and shudder. The demons believe it. They accept the fact that there's one God too, and they not only accept the fact, they know what it means. They know the implications of it, because he says, and they shudder. And so James uses a word that means bristle, like the bristle of a brush. But that's not talking about a brush. It's talking about what happens when you're very afraid. When you're very afraid, the hair on the back of your neck sticks up stiff. And that's what he's talking about. Even the demons grow that afraid out of the fact that there is one God. And if you believe that, good for you. Everybody believes that. Even the demons believe that. This is a case where faith that says, I accept all the facts of Christianity as true, believes that's faith. The agreement with the idea is enough. One of the problems that we struggle with is the concept of right doctrine. That as long as you have your doctrine right, as long as you have it lined up, that's enough. Now, there's good things about having your doctrine right. That means it will align your life right. But just knowing what it is and saying, I agree with that, doesn't do you any good. That's what a demon would say. Well, that's exactly who God is. I agree that that's the doctrine, that's the teaching. And so he says, you have this dead faith. Now let's return to that first verse for a moment. Can such faith, what kind of faith is that such faith? It's faith that's only in word only. One in word only. That's all you do. It's a word to you that you use to describe yourself. It's one that ignores the needs of others. It may feel sorry for them, but it won't lift a finger to help them. It's one that stresses the knowledge of the facts and is quite comfortable spouting the facts. And it's one that's proud of their faith without anything to support the claim. That you don't know if they do or not. That's a faith that is dead, is what James would call it. Remember, he's very practical. He doesn't care much about high-flown theology. If the theology doesn't filter down to your hands and your legs, if your hands don't become the hands of Jesus in this world, your theology is not worth much to him. In the first chapter, we've already heard him say, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. That's the premise. That somehow we can get into the condition where we know what the Word of God says. We've listened to it 1,000 times. It rolls through our minds like butter on a hot stove. And we don't think anything about it. And it doesn't affect anything in our life. It's just good words to know. That's dead faith. And we say, well, shouldn't you know the Bible? James doesn't dispute that. But I want you to think about this for a moment. Is that enough to know the truth? To know what the Bible says? Are you aware that Joseph Stalin, the dictator of communist Russia during the Second World War and a little beyond, who was responsible for the butchered death of 20 million people in his own country, he could recite the four Gospels by heart. He knew the truth. Did he have faith? We'd shake our heads, so I don't think I'd call that faith. And James would say, I don't think I would call that faith either. But there's not a lot of difference between somebody who knows what the Bible says and doesn't do anything about what it says, and yet they claim they have faith. It's dead faith. Because James's conclusion about such faith as that is that in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. It's empty. It's hollow. It's a corpse. It's just a bunch of words that nobody can verify. It's an idea, a concept, and not the driving part of your life. The problem is this seeks the bare minimum. That's what dead faith does. It accepts the bare minimum. Tell me exactly what I need to hold to at the very bottom, and I'll buy into that. But don't ask me to do anything else. Don't ask me to do much. It's kind of like what would happen if at a wedding, as the groom stood at the front and the bride came down the front and they turned around and they began to make their vows. And he said, before we start, let me just ask you a question. He turns to his wife-to-be and says, what's the least I need to be able to do to make you happy? I'll do that, but don't ask me to do any more. So what's the very least it's going to take to make you for you to be happy in this marriage? Would you marry a man who does that at the altar? I like what Wilbur Reese wrote several years ago. He called it $3 worth of God. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of him to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. There are a lot of people in the world that want $3 worth of God. They want the trappings of faith, the words, the concepts, the right thinking, the right morality in their minds. But when you look at their lives, it just lays there dead as a hammer. So James says, such faith, when unaccompanied by works or action or deeds, is dead. So what makes faith alive? James will take some time on this because it's not just the opposite, but it's that premise that he laid out in verse 18 where he says, you show me your faith without your deeds, and I will show you my faith in or by with my deeds. You want to know what live faith is? Live faith does something. It acts in accordance to what it believes. It moves in the right direction. I believe this, and therefore I must do this on that basis. That's live faith. And it's interesting the way he approaches this issue. He uses what could be called talking to an empty chair. I don't know if you've ever seen that or not. I did that once when I preached, and I found it in a book one time. I thought, I'm going to try that. I'm kind of experimental that way. I remember that morning I came a little bit early. I put two chairs up at the front on the stage, and they were facing each other. And I had to beat off all the well-meaning men who wanted to move the chairs out of the way because they didn't belong there. They don't know which kid put it up there. And I had to say, leave them there. You'll find out why later. And so as the sermon began, I went up, and instead of facing the audience, I sat down in a chair, and I started talking to the empty chair. I never faced the audience until the last sentence of the sermon. Because when you talk to the empty chair, you have to ask a simple question. Who do you want in that chair? And the answer is easy. The person in that chair is everybody who is listening. you get rapt attention when everyone puts themselves in that chair. And so James wants to talk to those who may be raising questions who are going, well, now, hold on for a minute. Are you saying we got to go over the top with this? Are you saying we got to become fanatical with this? He wants to discuss this live faith in a way that overcomes the objections that they might have. And so he begins by saying, maybe you need evidence that that premise is true. In verse 20, he says, you foolish person, you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Do you really want evidence? He said, it seems to be crystal clear, after all, faith is unaccompanied by deeds is dead. Shouldn't that be enough? And you have some of those people go, no, you're going to have to show me. So he said, okay, I'll show you. I'll give you two good illustrations of what I mean by this. Two things that will show this beyond a shadow of a doubt. One is the famous father of the faith, Abraham. The other is a more unsavory character named Rahab, the harlot. So he turns first to Abraham. Verse 21, he says, was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? The allusion is to the incident that takes place in Genesis chapter 22. There in Genesis chapter 22, he is told by God, commanded by God, take your son, your only son, the son that you love. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And you take him up to the top of Mount Moriah and you sacrifice him to me. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that passage is what it really does say. It says, early the next morning, Abraham arose. He did not procrastinate this. You could have always said, I overslept, and waited and said, well, I guess it's too late today. We'll have to try again tomorrow. That was not Abraham. He believed, and he was going to make it happen. As distasteful as it sounded, he was going to do what God asked him to do. Was he considered righteous? Yes, he was considered righteous. Was he considered righteous for what he did? Yes, he was considered righteous for what he did. So he says, let's go back to that and think about it. He says, see, because of that, his faith and actions were working together. Working together? Yes, they were working hand in glove. They were Siamese twins. You knew his faith by what he did. You knew he did what he did because of his faith. Now, that's an interesting term, working together. There's a buzzword around right now. The buzzword is called synergy. Now, synergy simply means I can do so much work and you can do so much work, but if we work together, we can do more than the two of us can do individually together. If you want to put an equation together, it's 1 + 1 = 3. That's what it means. There is more power in working together than there is working in isolation. That's the purpose of hitching 2 horses to a plow rather than 1. It's not just 2 horsepower, it's 4 horsepower. That's the combined compounded effect of labor. That's synergy. Why do I bring that esoteric business principle up right here? Because that's the word that James chooses to use. Faith and his actions were synergetic. They provided a combination to where there was great power in both the faith and the action. They were working together. His faith grew stronger because of what he did, and his deeds grew better because of what he believed. You can't separate them out. That's what true, righteous faith is about. And he goes on to talk about Abraham, and he said, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Complete. We've met that word a couple of 3 times already in the book of James. To be mature, to bring to completion, to bring to fruition, to get to the end. Well, in the world was Abraham's faith made complete by what he did? I think you need to go back and think about Abraham for a moment. Abraham has a sterling reputation But we tend to gloss over the low spots because his faith is an example of things, of peaks and valleys. He's at the Ur of the Chaldees, and God says, go to a land that I'll show you. And he goes, not knowing where he's going to go. He gets to that land and he seems to be faithful. But suddenly he gets in a pinch. And so he lies about the identity of his wife to save his own neck. He's down in a valley. He begins to climb again. But then all of a sudden he comes to this moment where God has made these promises to him that he is going to be a great nation. And the problem is he's getting older and his wife is getting older and they don't have any children and don't have any prospects of children. So he's going to help God make that out. He's going to help God with his problem. So he tries to adopt Eliezer as his heir, and God says, I'll have none of that. And then he goes out and he says, then I'll have a child by a handmaid, which was legal, but God says, that's not my plan either. He's back in the valley again. He goes and God says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to give you this land, and through you and your seed, the world will be blessed. He's back on top again. But then a few chapters later, he's back in the same pinch in Egypt. And he feels the need to lie about the identity of his wife Sarah again to protect his neck. He's back in the valley. Then he believes God again. And he waits and he has a son named Isaac. And you go through the whole story and you have to ask the question, how did his faith be made complete by what he did? I like what's said in the 22nd chapter of Genesis. As Abraham raises his hand with the knife and he's about to begin the downward plunge, God reaches out and stops his hand with an angel. And the Lord calls to him. And he says, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son, your only son. How did you know that everything had come together in Abraham's life? The answer is simple. He was willing to do the hardest thing when asked to do it. I'm going to suggest to you there's something else to that. That is, it helped convince Abraham that he believed if he would do that, sacrifice his son, his only son, the son that he loved, he must really believe God. And so the story tells itself that the actions he took were the ultimate expressions of faith. And so James begins to cap up the study of Abraham. And he says, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, and Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. Now, you can go to that, and commentators will run wild with it, talking about Genesis chapter 15 and how Paul uses this, how James uses it, and why do they do different things, and why there's all kinds of things. And those are interesting studies, but not for here. Because James goes on to say, you see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, not by faith alone. It's not just what they claim that they believe. It's not just about the beliefs that they hold. It's not just about their doctrines that they spout. It's about what they do with what they know that will show you how much they really believe. James says that's what you guys need to do. He says, do you need something else? Let me tell you something else. Let's talk about Rahab. Now, Rahab is so far apart from Abraham. Abraham had this history of faith before he ever gets to Genesis chapter 22. We meet Rahab one time. The spies come to Jericho as they're about to enter the promised land. and they need a place to hide, so they go to an obvious place in town where strangers go, a house of a prostitute. Do you know that she believes anything? You don't know that or not. When they walk in that door, they don't know what they're going to get. And yet, she says, we've heard the stories, and we're afraid. We're scared to death. Said, can you save me and my family? I'll give you lodging if you'll promise to protect me when you destroy this city. And so in verse 25 it says, in the same way as Abraham, was not even Rahab the prostitute, someone on the far other end than Abraham, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. She wasn't righteous because of who she was. She was only righteous because of what she did to show what she believed. It's the only way you can tell it. It would ring hollow for her to say, I believe in God and do nothing about it. But she did what she believed. She acted on what she believed by hiding the men and protecting them. So James comes down to the end of his discussion. He's talked about all the faith that is dead, that is by word only, that lines itself up with hollow sentiment, but won't lift a finger to help anybody. He's talked about the evidence that is right there, and that I've got all my doctrine lined up in the right way, and I believe the right things, and I've got the teachings just right. I've got my information down. And then he's talked about, but if that's all that is, it's dead. He says, if you want a live faith, that's a faith that prompts the actions of life. And so he comes down to the end. And he says, as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. It has no life in it. Faith without deeds is like a corpse laid out. It may have all the right evidence. It may have all the right beliefs. It may have all the right knowledge. But if it has no action that goes with them, it's stone cold. I realized that more and more when my parents passed away. First my mother and then my father. And I learned that once you went to the funeral home and they had embalmed the body and they laid it out, and you looked over in them, you realized this is just a body. There's no life here. Because they're not moving, they're not talking, they're not expressing things. And it's just a body at that point. And that's what faith is when it sits in a pew and it sings the right song, but it doesn't live anything like the song's sound. If faith is the facts you hold without a life to show it, that's when the corpse comes to church. So he's asking the question, does it make a difference in your life? Does your faith make a difference in your life? I just want you to think a little bit about what James has already said. Did it make a difference? He's holding this up and said, you people believe this, don't you? Then why is it that this is taking place? Does it make a difference in what you say? In the first chapter, he said, those who consider themselves religious but don't keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves. If it hasn't changed how you talk to people, if it hasn't mellowed out your speech, then what difference does your faith make? Is it alive or dead? Or what about others? He opened this chapter by two different groups of people coming to church. The rich are seated in the prime spots. The poor are seated up in the dirt. Did it make a difference, that faith of yours, in how you treated them when they came in? It's a question that lingers. Because you have to understand something. A very great principle says, if action and claim are different, always believe the actions. If we say we believe but don't act like it, no one will get the point because they'll trust what we do rather than what we say, because we're always delivering a message. And for us, we have to always ask, if in my daily life, as I live it, and what I do, and how I interact with other people, and how I deal with the problems of life, what message is my life delivering to other people? And would they believe the message I'm trying to deliver by listening to the message of my actions? James says, put your finger on your spiritual pulse. Is there life in your faith? Thank you for joining me today, and we'll be back again next week where we talk about that difficult little problem about the little organ in our mouth called the tongue and the trouble it gets us into. So I hope you'll join me again next week as we study the 3rd chapter of James. And have a good day. I appreciate you being with me. We'll see you next week.